So this is the newly redesigned Mac Mini with an M4 chip. It's Apple's smallest computer ever, and it packs a punch for its size. It's the Mac Mini's first major redesign since 2010, shrinking it down to almost an Apple TV size. And it also happens to be the very first Mac Mini I'll test and use. I currently use the M2 Ultra Mac Studio, but I'm really excited to see how this new Mac Mini compares with its M4 chip, especially when it's just a fraction of the Mac Studio's size and price. So as usual, let's unbox it, set it up, and I'll use the new Mac Mini for the week ahead, and then give you my honest thoughts on its redesign, the M4 chip's performance in daily use, and I'll share any negatives that I run into. So unboxed, the first impression has to be its minute size, like at 5 by 5 inches and only 1.5 pounds, that's half the size of the previous Mac Mini. Apple has really shrunk it down and now it's truly mini. But one of my first concerns right away is whether or not the Mini throttles performance, because it's so small that it might have bad thermal characteristics. And this is something I'll keep an eye out for, and I'll let you know if I experience any sort of workflow throttling later in the video. A very important difference between the M4 chipset and the M4 Pro is that on the M4 Pro Mac Mini, you'll get Thunderbolt 5 ports instead of Thunderbolt 4 here, which are significantly faster. You'll get up to 120 gigabytes per second transfer speeds compared to 40 gigabytes per second here. And the only other item in the box is the dark braided power cord. So yeah, that's it. Let's plug it in, go ahead and set this right up, and I'll let you know how this Mac Studio holds up over the week of testing. So the Mac Mini is known as a BYOKDM system, which you might have guessed stands for Bring Your Own Keyboard, Display, Mouse. So I've set this Mac Mini up with Apple's Studio Display, a Logitech keyboard, and the trusty Logitech MX Master 3S. While I test the Mac Mini from my desk, it's replacing the Mac Studio, and the Mac Mini is just so minuscule compared to the Mac Studio. The Mac Mini's dimensions have remained unchanged since 2010, back when it even had an optical drive. And overall, I think the redesign is a welcome change and frees up a lot of desk space, especially if you have a smaller desk like the one I'm using here for the week. It's also only 1.5 pounds, but interestingly, if you choose the M4 Pro variant, it's a touch heavier at 1.6 pounds. It's quite impressive that Apple has been able to squeeze what is a desktop computer, an M4 chip, into such a small box, just as small as almost the Apple TV. And I just love how minimal the entire desk setup looks with the Mac Mini. It also has that new thermal architecture very similar to the Mac Studio. Airflow now is directed in and out through the base vents, and this is absolutely an important change given the much smaller form factor and the additional power from the M4 chip. So after a few days of using the M4 chip in this mini form factor, I've got to say that the performance is great, like strangely great. It's so good and the benchmarks so wild. I had to retest its performance over and over just to make sure I was seeing the numbers right. In Geekbench 6, it scored a single core result of 3,856 and 14,954 multi-core. I had to double take on the single core performance because this puts its single core performance above the M2 Ultra Mac Studio and, well, all Macs actually, except for the M4 Max in the MacBook Pro. For something this small with a relatively cheaper price tag, this is mind-bogglingly good. The M2 Mac Studio still has significantly more memory bandwidth and GPU performance than the Mac Mini, so if maxing out as many GPU cores as possible is important to you, you'll probably want to still go with the MacBook Pro or Mac Studio. Comparing it to the M1 Max I first started to review like 4 years ago now, the M4 Mac Mini is on average 60 to 70% faster than the M1 in single core and multi-core tests. That's a big leap in only a 4-year period. The other big and overdue change is the 16 gigabytes of RAM that now comes as standard in the base configuration. That's a big win, but I doubt that Apple made the change because they listened to us and the hordes of users complaining about the base 8 gigabytes of RAM for years, but it's likely more a change to support the Apple Intelligence rollout and those hardware requirements used for Apple Intelligence. So with the increased RAM and M4 chip, they can now together process, I believe, almost 38 TOPS, which stands for trillions of operations per second and is a simple way to basically measure how powerful an AI chip is. That's another big leap considering the neural engine in the M2 processes about 16 TOPS, and this means the new Mac Mini can process a load more AI tasks even faster. The increased RAM doesn't just mean better support for Apple Intelligence either. It brings tangible day-to-day benefits, being able to keep more browsing tabs open without a slowdown in performance, faster boot up times, and better performance with RAM-intensive tasks like video editing and gaming. And speaking of gaming, the M4 Mac Mini gets hardware-accelerated ray tracing for the first time, which basically brings a high level of light simulation for realistic rendering in-game. That's about time, Apple, because this is a huge plus for gamers and a sign that Apple is taking gaming more and more seriously. I would not be surprised if we see an Apple gaming console at some point down the track, but that's just my random guess. And that's besides the point. I tried Firmament, one of the very few games currently that supports hardware accelerated ray tracing, and reflections and water look better than ever with ray tracing turned on. It can even run games like Resident Evil 4 at 1080p with a pretty stable 60 FPS on high settings. It looks properly great. But this is the base M4 Mac Mini, and it does struggle with gaming, so if you're going to be spending any amount of time gaming on your Mac Mini, or if you want to future-proof your Mac Mini to be able to game some more, you'll probably want to spend the extra dosh on the M4 Pro Mac Mini. But yeah, it's an exciting time for the Mac gaming frontier. Sometime next year, Mac users are even getting a Cyberpunk 2077 port filled with accelerated ray tracing. So I'm really keen to test that on both the M4 Mac Mini and Mac Studio. Alright, so using the M4 Mac Mini day to day, it's quite honestly as smooth as the M2 Ultra Mac Studio in most tasks, and good news is I've yet to experience any thermal throttling issues. I've been able to push the M4 for sustained periods of time outside of benchmarks, and the active cooling system does a great job at allowing the M4 to run at full speeds, so it's incredibly power efficient. Apps bounce only a couple of times before it's launched. I have 20 Chrome tabs open without an issue. Editing 16 megapixel RAW files on Lightroom is smooth. Large Figma wireframes can be navigated without stuttering. Really, the only major difference to my M2 Ultra Mac Studio is exporting these large files, 4K video render times, and 3D work, which is a lot more GPU intensive and requires significantly more RAM for faster output. People with heavy rendering and creative workflows will typically look at the Mac Studio anyway, but that's not to say that the M4 Mac Mini can't handle these more intense workflows at all. It just won't be as efficient or quick. And so I've sort of been left thinking that the pace of Apple's silicon development is just so rapid and so impressive. It's ridiculous how fast a Mac just 2 generations old is left in the dust, but also really exciting that so much computing power is accessible to most people at this price point. Now, pairing the Mac Mini with the Studio display has been the perfect couple. It works really well as a companion with its built-in webcam, smaller form factor, and built-in speakers that are much better than the Mac Mini's built-in speakers. But also the fact that, I could easily unplug the Mac Mini and then walk to another room and plug it into just about any display, keyboard, and mouse within minutes is just another draw card for the M4 Mac Mini. You could well pack this thing into a bag and set up a proper desktop system from essentially any desk. In some ways, it's an iPad Pro in a small box with a proper Mac operating system. It's also worth pointing out that it is super quiet in normal workloads. If you're just web browsing, the fans will never turn on, and Apple Silicon being notoriously quiet is life-changing and so peaceful when working in a quiet room. The base model storage of 256GB is also pretty tight, but nothing that can't be fixed with an external SSD. And even since macOS 15.1, you can store and open apps from the external SSD and set it up as the default storage path for new app installs as well. Now, moving on to the negatives, and here's what I've found so far. The speakers aren't so good, no surprise there. They are surprisingly though better than the M2 Mac Studio inbuilt speakers, which are pretty terrible, but overall you'll absolutely still want to use dedicated speakers or headphones for music or audio work. Secondly, why the heck is the power button now at the bottom of the Mac Mini? Does this not go against simple design principles of like placing a button in accessible areas of a product? I'm starting to think that the Magic Mouse design team is gaining some serious influence internally at Apple. And how is putting ports and power buttons underneath a product gaining more momentum over there? But speaking of the design, although the Mini form factor is smaller than ever, I've also realized it's so small and so light that it slips when plugging in cables. Something to be careful of: if you position your Mac Mini at the end of a desk, there's a small chance it could drop right off your desk if you're not careful. It's also a bit of a bummer that the Mac Mini doesn't come with 10 gigabit Ethernet as standard. It's an additional $100 extra during checkout if you want that extra speed. You know, that's very Apple. To be fair, I wouldn't call any of these things massive deal breakers, all things considered. So it's actually been kind of tough to nitpick the Mac Mini M4 for negatives, but that's what I've found so far. And frankly, coming into this review, I was expecting the Mac Mini to be good, but not this good. Apple really hit a homer with this one. The Mac Mini has been sidelined for a little while now, but this redesign and M4 chip has given the Mac Mini a brand new life, and practically every single change Apple has made deserves big praise. The mind-boggling M4 chip crammed into a small package is an extremely compelling offer at just $599 US or 999 Australian dollars, and at this price range, the now base 16 gigabytes of RAM is the icing on the cake, especially for potential buyers still using an Intel-based Mac. The M4 Mac Mini is probably the most impressive Mac I've tested yet, all things considered. There's always the argument, of course, for buying a MacBook Pro instead. It has more portability and you can use it in a docked setup, but the little overachiever that is the M4 Mac Mini is just at such a great price range. It's made for those who either need a portable desktop setup, you want a solid performing Mac without the top end bells and whistles required for more intensive apps and rendering. Overall, the M4 Mac Mini is a redesign done right, and if your older iMac or Mac Mini is currently running on fumes, this Mac Mini M4 is likely the Mac to replace it. And at this rate, a new M4 Mac Studio is going to be insane.